Hi guys, in today's video we'll cover every core React concept, every hook, every pattern, all the way up to React 19, basics to advanced in one map to help you see the big picture of how React works. We'll cover 70 concepts across 13 sections, and I will give you a one-line summary for every single one of those concepts. At first, the mental model, the handful of ideas that make everything else in React click right away. Here at first we're gonna describe the declarative UI, meaning that React is declarative, meaning you describe what the UI should look like for a given state, and React figures out the document object model for that. So you don't have to use more of a handwriting, create element stuff, document create element in JavaScript. UI is mostly using the functions, meaning that the whole app is one idea. UI equals a function of a state, change the state, and React re-renders the screen. That's the entire mental model behind actually how React works. The next big concept is a virtual DOM, meaning that under the hood, React builds the lightweight version of a document object model, and then it compares the difference between the old one against the new one, and only patches the versions and changes that actually happened. And of course, composition, the most common concept. Everything is built from components, as you probably know, and components are the small pieces that nest into the bigger pieces, like Lego for example, but this concept is known in HTML or whatever actually front-end language, front-end structure you have out there. You can think about it as div elements in a HTML structure. Now components and JSX, so the building blocks and the actual pieces that you write every day in the React framework. At first, function component, you have to understand that the component is just a function that returns JSX, meaning that this is just your unit for UI. And JSX is the HTML-like syntax that compiles down to create element calls that you know from JavaScript. And the curly braces let you drop JavaScript right in the React files. Next, props are the inputs you pass from parent to child, read-only elements, like the components agreements. Data flows down one direction always. So what are those children? If you pass JSX as a props between the tags and you get it as a children, that's how you build flexible wrappers and layouts. If you need to return two elements without an extra div, then you can wrap them in a fragment, as you can see on the screen. This is an empty angle brackets that you don't really gonna see in a document object model elements. It helps to get rid of div nesting elements when you have a lot of divs after divs after divs nested inside each other, only to actually have some block elements that's gonna control the page. Conditional rendering is really useful when you want to show or hide with a ternary operators. So for example, AND or logic. It gives you opportunity to switch those components that you really want to see on a page, depends of some status. Like for example, user is logged in or log out. Events are camel case handlers, like for example, on click or on change, and gives you the synthetic events. It is a common conception that is going from a JavaScript, so also there we have the same events like click or change that you add on DOM elements. About styling, you can style in however you like. Use class names, inline styles, CSS models, CSS in JS or Tailwind. Pick your own approach or test whatever you want actually. The third section is about the state and the core hooks. This is where React comes alive, so state is how a component remembers things and re-renders when they change. The most common hook is definitely useState, so it gives a component local state, a value and a setter, calls the setter and React re-renders the component itself. That's the React reactivity in two lines of code, meaning that calling setCount will actually override count variable and triggers the re-render. Concept of immutability means that you never mutate the state directly. Always make a new object or array so React can see it changed. Also spread it and don't really push elements into this. Next is batching, meaning that multiple set states calls in the same event get batched into a single render. This is React working under the hood to make a better optimization of your web page. If you have a complex related state, useReducer is your tool. A state, an action, and a reduce function. It's basically a tiny Redux built-in. Gives you option to handle more complex related state. Lazy initial state is mostly used if your initial value is expensive to compute. You can pass a function. React returns it once, not on every render. It's really good if you don't really want to re-render every time really heavy data components. Concept of lifting state up is used when two components need the same state. So lifting it up means that you're gonna lift them to their closest common parent and pass it back down. And the revert state means that you can calculate something from existing state. Just calculate it during render. You don't have to store it twice in a browser memory. Fourth section is about the side effects and the lifecycle in React world. Side effects are how your component talks to the world outside React. Fetching data, timers, subscriptions, and how to sync without shooting yourself in the foot. Next really common hook is a useEffect. It runs side effects after render, meaning you can use that for fetching, subscriptions, timers. After render and the paint from CSS, then the effect fires. The dependency array controls it. Dependency array give you opportunity to actually manage how many re-renders and when will happen. Empty array runs once. When you use some depths inside of the array, it will reruns when those depths will change. And when you leave it off, it runs every single render. Cleanup function. If you return a function from your effect, that's your cleanup. Unsubscribe, clear the timer, etc. It runs on unmount and before the next effect. You might not need an effect is actually a concept that you honestly and probably don't really need to use that useEffect, for example. Transforming data from a render or handling a click, do it during render or in the handler, not in the effect state. Use layout effect is the same idea, but it fires before the browser paints. Use it when you need to measure the DOM and avoid a flicker, for example. And use insertion effect. Fires even earlier, but that's one really for CSS in JS libraries authors, not just your app code. So keep it as a reference. The fifth section is the refs and the DOM. It's useful when you need to escape React and touch the real document object elements directly. Focus on input, measure a node, that's what refs are for. UseRef is a mutable box that survives re-renders and never triggers one. It's perfect for grabbing a document object model node or holding a value between renders. In React 19, ref is just a prop. You can pass it straight to a function component. And because of that, you don't really need anymore a forward ref component, so we'll not really talk about that. It's just good to remember that forward ref was the old way to pass ref down to a child elements. It still works, of course, but it's a legacy now. Use imperative handle lets you expose a custom API on ref, like a focus or reset method that parent can call. And in React 19 we have also ref callback cleanup. Ref callback can now return a cleanup function. It means that it will run when the node unmounts. Next big section is about context. When passing props down gets painful, context lets you share data across the whole tree. Not drilling required. Like for example in a props. Create context and use context. Context kills prop drilling. Instead of passing a value through 5 layers, create context and use context, teleport it straight to where it's needed. And in React 19, the context itself is the provider, meaning that you can just wrap your tree around provider and it will pass the correct data. You have to remember that there is also a moment when you don't really have to use context, because context isn't for high frequency updates. Because of that, it can actually change it on every keystroke and you re-render the whole subtree over and over again. Seventh section is about performance. It's all about how React skips work it doesn't actually need to redo. And especially in React 19, a lot of this become automatic. For example, React Memo. It skips re-rendering a component when its props haven't changed at all. Use Memo caches an expensive calculation between renders. And use callback caches a function's identity, so children don't re-render for nothing. But here's something that happened also in React 19. The React compiler does all of that automatically. It writes a plain code, it adds the memory for you, most of those free hooks just disappear because of React compiler. And also there is a keys concept, so a little neat trick, meaning that you can actually change a component's key and React remounts it fresh. It gives you an instant state reset whenever you want and whenever you need it. In the 8th section we're gonna talk about more advanced hooks. Concurrent hooks are the React's way of keeping the UI snappy while heavy work happens in the background. For that we use, for example, a use transition, so it marks an update as a non-urgent. So urgent stuff like typing stays smooth, and you get it as a isPending flag, for free. Use deferred value renders a slightly stale copy of a value, so the input stays instant while the heavy results catch up a bit later. UseID generates stable, unique IDs for accessibility, wiring a label to an input. And they match across server and the client, so no hydration mismatch here. UseSync external store is how you subscribe to an outside store, like Redux, Zustamp, Browser API, safely in concurrent React. And the last, use debug value. It just labels your custom hook nicely in React DevTools, and DevTooling only. Next we have a Suspense, lazy loading and use function. It helps to have a loading states done right. Suspense shows a fallback, a spinner, while its children are loading, whenever that's a data or code. React Lazy splits a component, so its JavaScript only loads when you actually render it. And use function is the new one. It renders a promise or a context right during render. And unlike every other hook, you can call it conditionally or in a loop. And error boundaries catch renders errors and show fallback UI instead of widescreen. Now action and forms. In React 19, actions completely rethink how you handle forms and async work. At first, action. This is React 19's biggest shift. An action is just an async function wired into a transition. And React handles the pending state, the errors, and optimistic updates for you. All that manual is loading and try-catch boilerplate is actually gone. You can pass a function straight to a forms action prop, and it runs on submit with the form data. Use action state manages that action's result and its pending flag in one hook. Use form status lets a child, like for example a submit button, read the parent form's pending status and be disabled itself while it submits. And of course, use optimistic shows the result instantly. Your chat messages appears right away, then relocates when the server confirms. 11th section is about server components and modern architecture, meaning that moving rendering back to the server and the new line between server and the client code. At first, server components render on the server, ships zero JavaScript to the browser and can hit your database directly. In frameworks like Next.js, they are the default now. If you want to use hooks, for example, you have to use useClient for that at the top of the file. Then you can use all the client's components. useServer lets you call server code from the client like a normal async function. Mutations and form actions, no manual API routes. And streaming SSR sends the HTML in chunks. The shell shows up first and slow widgets stream as they are ready. Hydration is the moment the server's HTML wakes up and becomes interactive, when the client's JSS attached. And about custom hooks, rules and patterns. The patterns means how you reuse logic cleanly, plus the rules that keep hooks from breaking. At first, a custom hook is just a useEffect function that bundles reusable stateful logic. Duplicated logic in two components collapse into one. The rules of hooks: call them at the top level only, never in a loop or condition, and only from components or other hooks. Inputs are either controlled, value driven by state, or uncontrolled, where the DOM holds the value and you read it with a ref. Render props are higher order components, where the old reuse patterns mostly replaced by custom hooks today. But it's worth knowing how it actually works. Create portal renders children into a different DOM node, perfect for modals and tooltips that need to escape their parents' overflow. In React 19, you can drop a title or meta anywhere in the tree, and React hoists it up into the head. And preload, pre-init, prefetch DNS from React DOM lets you hit the browser to start fetching earlier. On the last thing, everything that lives around React but isn't React itself. You will reach for those on almost every real project. As you can see here, we have tools for routing, data fetching, global state, forms, styling, and of course, meta frameworks. That will be all for today's video. In the future, I will try to break down all of those pieces into a smaller context, so you will have a deep dive for every single one of those sections. But for today, that will be all. Thank you so much for watching and see you in the next video.